For an IP strategy to be effective, it needs to be part of a much wider, full commercialization strategy.
How you manage your IP matters earlier on when you're trying to shape your offering.
The first business model you think you've got it nailed and your customers are going to buy it this way with so many users, that business model won't be the one that actually succeeds.
Welcome to the IP-driven startup podcast from Marks & Clerk. Today, we're diving into the Triple Chasm approach to scale-up with Dr. Uday Phadke and Sam Dods, co-founders of Triple Chasm. With 30 years bridging scientific innovation and commercial success, Uday challenges conventional wisdom about turning breakthrough research into businesses that create real impact. Sam brings insight on leadership behaviour and strategic focus that drive tech scale-ups forward. Can you give us a little bit of a summary or an overview around the methodology, the way you guys advise in terms of innovation, commercialization and scale-up? Do you want to give our viewers and our listeners a feel for what that methodology involves?
First thing to say is that the tools were built based on global research. So there were several thousand companies across the world which provided data, which helped us to understand how this translation journey of an innovation, all the way from an IP lab to a fully commercially successful product happens. But if you talk about the key elements of the methodology, and Sam may want to add to this as well, is that there are, I guess, three key things.
The first one was around can I develop a prototype and validate that, get some initial validation. Most in the data, I think you found most all around the world and all markets pretty good at that. Chasm 2 is the killer when you're trying to build the business model off the back of that validated prototype, and then Chasm 3 is the true scaling of the customers. So that metric was quite powerful just to notice these are the patterns happening. But then those, and we call them mesoeconomic vectors because we're engineers, so it's just it does have a very particular meaning, but in pragmatic terms, these are the levers. So it started out with 174 different factors that were considered in the research, collapsed to these 12, and we've grouped them into external vectors, so external considerations. So these ventures, these are things you don't control, but you need to understand. And then all the internal vectors, so these are the things we have more control over, and then the composites. And I guess on those externals, there were four sort of elements that we saw as being key. One is really understanding markets. So often when you speak to a venture about market, they'll say Sam and Tam and so on. So they'll tell you about size. What we're talking about is the structure. That's what we noticed. People needed to understand how it's structured in terms of a value chain. So if I'm taking a product to market, like a new drug or something, it's early research, it's picking targets, it's picking molecules all the way through to clinical trials and then to a patient. And once you've got that kind of picture of the value adding steps, under that, where are we playing? Where's the partners? Where's the regulations apply? All that stuff. And that's when you really understand the market. Then when you found the pull in the market, where are the customers? And then are these customers government or business? Is it big business, small business, consumers? Yeah. And then the fourth element there was, once you've nailed all that, how do I go to market? And more particularly, how do I scale the customers through channels? So that was, to get back to the point there, that was the external vectors, and then the internal. So when we're working like with Andy at Alderley Park with the scientists, they're much more comfortable here generally, because the first one is about the science and what's going to be deployed into the product, and the second is exactly what you spend all your time doing, is the IP strategy. And then the third is, but based on that science, what's the product we're actually going to sell? And it's a bit of a concept for some of the scientists to think your technology isn't the thing that's going to be sold. And then once I've synthesized my product, how do I manufacture and deploy it? Once I've worked out how I'm going to get it out there, who's going to maintain it, who's going to move the data around, then it's the fifth element is, how do I structure a team, a business around taking that product to market? And then the sixth of them is, how do I fund it? So it's typically the ventures are very excited there, but trying to understand how you do that, and then bringing it all together is the composites. So across all of these, where is in my strategic level, where is my strength in my framing? So I guess if you pick up some of the ventures or the TTOs, they've got some super strong science and they want to get patents. And that is certainly one model, but sometimes some ventures might have unbelievable market clarity. They might see different elements, some have different strengths. So that's the first of the composites. Then the last is the big spreadsheet, the big business model. So how do I get money in? How do I get money in?
The composites are really, it's the trade-offs. How much is what you're trying to do driven by market pull? How much is driven by technology push? And it's that balance, because it's different for different companies, different for different businesses. And ultimately, I guess the key message is that your strategic differentiation is what's going to help you to succeed in the marketplace. So it's not a question of saying, I want to be like Google or I want to be like Microsoft. It's saying, what do I want to be? What do I need to be in order to be successful?
So there are those two key elements. One is a metric of how far along. Then you've got these 12 elements of what you need to think about. And I guess the real power comes when you pull it all together and you show at every stage, at every CRL, what matters. Out of those vectors, what do the teams need to look at? And then if you take that data and you take the 10%, so remember this research was into how the system was behaving, and 10% is the sort of number that people generally think make it through the journey, and that's exactly what happened in the data set out of the 3,000. If you take that and subtract the rest off it, that's when we really get the insights. What was the difference between the successful ventures and unsuccessful ventures? And that's what's embedded into our tools and stuff like that. So venture teams can then benchmark themselves against success and see where do we need to be focusing.
So I've had a little read around the white paper that's on the Triple Chasm website, familiarize myself with the Chasm 1, 2 and 3. What I noticed from the IP management vector is that it seemed to be more relevant from the studies you've done, at least during the early stages, during Chasm 1 and Chasm 2. Is that a fair conclusion based on my review of the white paper, and what are your thoughts behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonably good summary, which says that how you manage your IP matters earlier on when you're trying to shape your offering. And so around Chasm 1, it's to do with some of the fundamental aspects of your intellectual property. You know, what do you have? Do you have scientific know-how? Do you have patents? Or do you have specific know-how? Or do you have some sort of process know-how? And of course, what happens is that as you grow your business, at Chasm 2, you're really thinking about how you deploy some of this stuff, and stuff like freedom to operate, which you spend so much time advising people about. Who else is doing what you're doing? How could they get in your way? How can you avoid those challenges? By the time you get to Chasm 3, you're really trying to do mass scaling. And so the important point to note is most companies, when they build their first product, will focus on Chasm 1 and 2. But as they start to move forward and they start to build a portfolio of products, then they start to think about IP in different ways for the successive products. So it isn't something that just goes away. It changes in its nature.
So guys, based on your experience of working with multiple companies over the years, have you got any particular case studies, be it named or unnamed, that have demonstrated the traits of what is going to be a really scalable and a successful startup venture?
Do they have some strong differentiating IP, intellectual property? That's a powerful start. But the second differentiator is those people who figure out what their product or service should be. And it's the shaping of that product and service. That's where you see the difference between those people who succeed and those who fail. I think one of the things is understanding where the opportunities are. And I think that that reflects quite a lot the structure of a market you're operating in. And one of the things we've noticed is that we have a very mature market where the structure is not changing very much. Then the opportunities for newcomers, new players coming in are smaller. Then because the level of innovation that can be your differentiation tends to be smaller in those. So I would say the places, if you want to succeed, are where market structures are changing dramatically. And the best examples of that, if you go back to around 2000, would be in the media space. Media and entertainment companies. None of us could have predicted what the world would look like in 2025 with online platforms and Netflix and everybody else. But just think back, the places like Blockbuster, you could go and rent a DVD from around the corner. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's because of structure in the market, and that's changed. But if you roll forward, the place where there's a huge amount of structural change right now is in life sciences and healthcare. And so that's kind of a macro picture about things that succeed, things that don't.
One of the other episodes that we filmed as part of this podcast series, our guest was very much focusing on people and teams, the open-mindedness of founders and the quality of the people that are driving the business forward. How important is that in your methodology and based on your experience?
You're talking about what we call vector I5, human capital. And that's very, very important, as your previous speakers may have pointed out. And the other vector, which is relevant, is funding and investment, vector I6. So those two are very important vectors, which are part of the internal vector family. So they are very, very important and critical. But part of the output from the research, when I started this, set up the research team, we started to look at it, there was this view that investors would invest in companies where there was a strong leadership team. And so the importance of human capital was really highlighted. And the second part of the narrative was, and it's all about funding and investment. And one of the interesting things that came out, because we did over 3,000 companies globally, was the realization that those two vectors are very, very important, but they're not the whole story. Yeah. And so in that sense, it was counterintuitive from what everybody else was thinking at the time. And in particular, remember, we looked at with these 12 vectors, what's the percentage contribution from each of these vectors along the journey? And when it came to human capital, and particularly the style of leadership and the quality of the leadership, it was never more than contributing to more than 10% of the success of a company. And I remember talking to the dean of Harvard Business School and saying, this seems rather low because you guys big up the whole notion of leadership and talent. And he said, no, it's consistent with our data, except we don't usually talk about it because it's less fashionable to talk about it, right? And the same is true of investment, funding and investment. It's not so much the quantum of money, it's the type of money you bring in and the stuff that comes with it, all the constraints. So that was a big revelation, which is to say that it's not just about skills and human capital and funding or technology. And so the story was, it's a binary. The conventional wisdom is there's a binary model which says that technology is really important and money is important. So if you listen to our chancellor, for example, it's always about technology and funding. And then they'll throw in skills as the third thing. But there's very little discussion about market structures changing, where the opportunities really are, about how you handle regulation and therefore how you handle intellectual property in the context of regulation. So I would say that as a country, we need to understand that more, because that's where some of the secret of growth lies.
One of the things I've picked up on when sitting through some of your accelerators, guys, is you're very good and very keen to emphasize that the IP strategy should be absolutely commercially aligned. And one of the aspects of that is selecting the right IP rights. Is it patents that you need? Is it designs that you need? Would a trademark suffice for what the business needs? Is this something that you've picked up in terms of things that are going wrong for some of the clients you've worked with or some of the ventures you've supported over the years? Or is it something that is just you've kind of picked up through your own experience in business?
You probably see the same as we see. So, for an IP strategy to be effective, it needs to be part of a much wider full commercialization strategy. So we will get people that'll just focus on a single element, and it might be, can I get a patent on this? And if you talk them through, for example, what's the market space that you're going into, and they're starting to think through, and they're finding the traction, and they're finding the regs, and they're shaping their product with that, then they're understanding their customer buying, then that's feeding into shaping their prototype and their product and their manufacturing distribution. If they've thought through that and they have a fairly comprehensive set of thinking, when they come to you, it's a lot easier to help them, I imagine, rather than just, we've got something, we think we're going to make a product something like this, and it's an impossible starting point. It needs to be all of it. The IP strategy, the whole lot, needs to be part of an integrated story. And that's, typically when we walk the ventures through all the vectors, you go through them one by one, and it's like, oh my God, this is hard going. And then after a while, it's like getting, oh my God, it's all interrelated. So if I make a decision there, that actually influences.
How are you finding in the digital healthcare space the barrier, I guess, for adoption into the clinic? Of course, it's always tricky for our domestic startup companies to sell to our local healthcare system. The NHS adoption is not always the easiest thing to do. Is this a barrier for digital healthcare in the UK, or is this something that we can work through?
Well, I mean, so we spend a fair bit of time on running programs for the NHS, and this always comes up. If you have that S curve and the customers are going to take up, honestly, in the NHS is always the comment. So you do end up, in the reality of understanding those external vectors, that there are certain ways that you have to work here, and plenty of these ventures will succeed, but sometimes on a slower journey, or they will use what they achieve here and the early sales and acceptance here, and then step to the States or the Middle East or other markets. So, it's a reality that this market behaves in a certain way.
But if you look at the implementation of stuff which fundamentally depends on digital technology, then one of the things there's been a greater realization is when if you're talking about technology, then digital technology is what we call pervasive technology, which means that they are pervasive. They're very broad. And so you can have a very wide range of things you need to worry about. But there's some critical things there when you're working with digital technologies, which is that it's very, very unlikely that you're going to be working on fundamental primary patents, because those belong to some tech company that's done the fundamental work. So if you're looking at digital health IP, you're going to be looking at process IP, how stuff is implemented, what the processes are. You're going to be looking at copyright. You're going to look at ownership of insights. Because some of the ownership of insights, what we call metadata, where you take data and you try and distill what really matters out of that. That is a much more complicated picture. And you mentioned the NHS and other stuff. One of the challenges we have is that, and this is my personal view, is that the procurement regime in the UK with the NHS is really needs to be radically overhauled, because that procurement regime was designed for a time when point technologies, like a new widget or a new device, was going to be taken to market. And so all this regulation around type 1, 2, A, B medical devices, that's what it was designed to do. And now we have something very, very different. And so the NHS is aware of it and they're working on it, and the MHRA and other people. But there's going to need to be quite a different approach. And that, in a way, is a challenge and an opportunity for people like you and us working in the whole IP space, which is that it isn't business as usual.
But I mean, if you get the teams to really think through how it's structured, they can find opportunities too. So, virtual wards has been a big thing for the last 5 years or so. So if I sell a testing device that can be used at home, the virtual ward companies could be my customer or my route through. So it's to get them to really drill down and see what's happening in that market space and find different ways in. Because most ventures, when you start, you think you're going to direct sell to a customer, and then you work out after a while that's not going to happen. I need to work out alternative ways in. And the NHS is
and if you remind yourself that NHS is 3% of the global market if you're a healthcare company. So, and it's great getting traction in the NHS because you can demonstrate traction in your home market, but your business model and your strategy for internationalization may be very different from proving your product in a domestic market here. And that means that, for example, if you're trying to take an innovation that's going into an NHS, say, oncology treatment ward, and you're trying to take that into a market, say, in Indonesia or Morocco, it's very different, because the procurement of healthcare services and who pays is going to be very, very different. So you could say, wow, this means that my IP strategy may be mediated by changing customer behavior. And that's real. That is real. And against that, we have this tension of some of the larger players in the market trying to regulate the use of IP based on as if their model is what's going to apply, around the world.
So we've spoken a little bit about digital health. What are the other sectors or areas of technology that are exciting you at the moment that you think are really going to start becoming more prominent and start growing?
If you took a technology perspective, what I call a vector I1 perspective, which is actually not just about the technology itself, but it's about how the technology is deployed, what we call contingent technology deployment. then I think that when you're starting to, Sam has already said, if you're looking at what hot areas of technology there, and pervasive technology, there's a massive expansion of pervasive technologies which are ubiquitous across all market spaces. Call them digital, call them digitally related technologies. But they really they acquire the power to change something in innovative terms once they are integrated with focused technologies, such as like imaging, for example, or signal measurement, or processing power. And so when people talk about quantum as being a sexy, exciting area, on its own, it's not going to do anything, in my view, until you actually link it together with what pervasive technologies enables you to do. And sadly, or maybe not so sadly, the same is true around all the big story around AI. And then the other is the use of platforms, and how are platforms going to operate in terms of knitting this together. And so I think it's the crossover between different technologies. I think that's where the action is going to be. And if you said, where are the exciting, what do I think where the exciting things are going on? I think in healthcare and life sciences, there's a huge amount of stuff going to change around the delivery of healthcare intervention, right? You probably read the NHS white paper talks about the 3 shifts. And the second shift is about saying we're moving to digital. That's a very easy thing to say, but in reality it embodies a lot of stuff. But if you're going to do a new therapeutic intervention for, say, a gene therapy which cures a rare disease in a child, then there's a lot of interesting things. So I think, so if you ask me where's the exciting, I would say healthcare. There's some very big things happening which will transform the way we diagnose, how we deliver healthcare, preventative healthcare, to do with understanding your propensity to get a particular kind of disease. One of the jokes was, I used to say, we're all proto-patients. We haven't become patients yet, but we will one day, right? And so that's a very hot area, I think. In terms of the other spaces, I think there's a lot going on in terms of the whole area around the applications of AI to different places outside of healthcare as well, where there's use of data, and that includes things like food production, primary markets which are about healthcare, food production, computing, and so I think that's where the interesting thing is going to be, and I think there's one key word, if I was going to say, underpins all that, is data. The role of data is something that's really quite underestimated at the moment, and the discovery of patterns of behavior that data shows you. So pattern matching, pattern recognition is going to be a very, very big area.
Stepping away from those IP specific aspects, and perhaps even stepping away from some of the known vectors that you've studied, what are you observing in terms of things that are killing startup companies from the get-go?
Could I just step back into the data for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Remember I said if you take the successful 10%, subtract the rest, then you start getting these green lumps that are done differently. So the headliner that we talk about all the time, particularly in the early stage, the biggest difference between success and failure was prior to Chasm 1, so prior to your prototyping, those ventures that really put a lot of effort into understanding their market space and their framing their proposition and their customers were successful. So everybody gets, like product market, they get those loose terms, but the data actually shows if you don't do that, you're more likely to fail. And then some of the programs we run, we're at Chasm 2, so they're working on the business model. And then you say, well, okay, talk me through your market space and your validation with your customer. Oh, yeah, well, I spoke to Bob and Fred, and they both said they like my thing and they'll probably buy it. And then they've gone ahead and spent loads of money and built a business model or a theoretical business model on all of this. And then you discover they actually don't understand the market space. They haven't actually got a customer base there. And they've spent the last 2 or 3 years heading towards Chasm 2 without having done that job. And if there's any headline, and I think that comes out of our data, that is the biggest finding. It's just customer discovery. Actually understand the market and the customers within it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and picking up on that, it's actually understanding the structure of that market and how it might change, because there's some big structural changes coming down the line. And so it's not something you do once and then think, I've got it figured out, I'm going to now build my product. It's something you need to have a continuous awareness of. So I would say that the kind of the big red flag is when people have a great technology idea and their universities told them this is brilliant. And sometimes maybe an investor who's given them some money to do it, but they have no idea about how it's going to be deployed in a customer environment. So I would say that's probably the most important thing, is clarity on the structure of the market and how you're going to get into that market, right? Your entry strategy. And the second, which is related to the first, is where people don't actually have an idea of what they're selling. Some of them may have some idea who the customer is, but they think that having the technology in itself is enough without knowing what the thing they're going to sell to their customer is. And when I say the thing, the products, it's really understanding, are you actually selling a device? Are you selling data? Are you selling an insight? Are you selling an integrated offering? Are you providing a platform? So that's the bit, that's the second bit, and it's not about the old-fashioned terminology people used to use about product market fit. If you're talking about product market fit, that's a sort of a minor aspect of this whole thing. Because if you don't know what your product service proposition is, then you have not much chance of deciding what the fit is. Because you might change your proposition, what the product you're building, based on what the market needs. And if I pick a real practical example of this, if you look in terms of say, look at the NHS and the tools they're trying to do. They talk a lot about trying to do genotype, phenotype mapping, trying to identify populations at risk. But if you're going to provide a screening product or service to the NHS, that involves a lot more than just being able to demonstrate that this gene relates to this phenotype. So it's that clarity about your product service proposition, I would say, is the second kind of key gotcha. And the third is where there's a mismatch between what you're trying to do and the resources that you will be able to deploy. So people will think, oh, I'm going down this big dream. I'm going to go and raise a lot of money, or I'm going to get a lot of resources. And the reality is that you can't make this thing up. So calibrate your focus based on the resources that are going to be available to you. I mean, I would say those are the kind of key things.
I mean, I guess too, if you just track them along the journey, Chasm 2 is the kind of build a viable business model. So at the start, if you talk to very, very early stage ventures, you'll ask them about market or something, and they'll say, well, it's worth 50 billion. We just want 1% of it. So start quite naively. And then we say from the bottom up, how many customers, how many users, unit price, trying to get that sort of thing. And they don't get, and I think in the data, what they showed was crossing that chasm on average took 6.7 attempts. So the first business model, you think you've got it nailed and your customers are going to buy it this way with so many users, so the clinicians or the users or something, it's per user or something, that business model won't be the one that actually succeeds. And then where it starts getting really interesting is that if they get investment in from a VC who's bought into your business model, and then you vary your business model. But hold on, you told me this is the business model. So I think that's a big part too, is to actually acknowledge this is a gray zone and you need to keep experimenting. I think you made the same point about IP in certain areas. It's not like I've ticked it and I never have to go to freedom to operate again. This is the same thing. When I'm crossing that chasm, it takes lots of effort, lots of thought, trying, going backwards and learning quickly. So the people, can they actually learn quickly? And you'll work with different people you see. I'm not sure they're listening too much. I'm not sure they're engaging. And some people you work with, you can just tell they're just nailing it and going back and trying. And they're not being defensive about this model or this approach. They're actually trying to learn all the way.
Well, that was really interesting, guys. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks for listening to the IP-driven startup podcast from Marks & Clerk. If today's conversation got you thinking about your own IP strategy, we can help. Download our free ebook, The IP-Driven Startup, for practical guidance on building patent portfolios that attract investment and maximize exit value. Then speak to our expert team, because the most successful startups don't leave IP protection to chance. They build it into their strategy from day one.